Hello and welcome to today's Partner Infopedia web conference. This is Fast Track Dynamics 365 for Operations Tech Talk, AX 2009 to Dynamics 365 for Operations Migration Tools. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Principal Group Program Manager Manoj Swasamathanan. Manoj, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Janice. Hello, everyone. Today, we will actually take a look at migrating AX 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations. So AX 2009, as you all know, is released this around 2008 calendar year. So Janice, I have to interrupt. I'm hearing a lot of feedback.
You're hearing some audio feedback?
Yeah, I'm hearing everything twice. I'm sorry.
All right. That's all right. Give me one moment here. All right, Manoj, it looks as though you have a web browser open in the background. That's probably where your second audio source is coming from. Yes, the one on the left there, you'll want to close that.
This one, is it good now?
I don't know. You tell me. You're still hearing the second audio?
No, I'm not hearing the second audio now. I'm good.
All right. Good to go.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. Hello, everyone, once again. My name is Manoj Swaminathan. I am a group program manager as part of the solution architecture team as part of the R&D. Today, we will take a look at migrating AX 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operation. As you all know, AX 2009 release was actually done during the calendar year 2008. Since then, we've actually made significant changes to the product. We've actually done two set of releases, if you were to. One was AX 2012, and then we've also done another major release called Dynamics 365 for operations. And the AX 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operation, there's significant shift in terms of the applications functionality, as well as the platform capabilities, right from being able to have this release as just a pure on-prem release to now being able to be truly an online release that's hosted in Azure. And we truly understand that customers who are running in AX 2009 would like to actually be able to switch to leverage some of the newer capabilities that what we have provided. And as part of enabling that, we have some tool set that what we are offering out of the box. And one of the tool set is to be able to actually migrate your data from 2009. I'm categorically calling this as a migrate as opposed to an upgrade, as typically as what you would see. And there's a reasoning for it, and I'll explain that in a bit. So what is our target scenario? Our target scenario is to be able to actually help customers migrate from legacy AX versions without having to do a full upgrade. And we're starting that kind of a journey with AX 2009 as a basis. And our intent is to actually support similar mechanisms for customers coming from other releases as well as the other products, like, for example, AX 4.0 release, or some of the earlier releases, and even for that matter, other product lines such as Dynamics Navision or Dynamics Great Plains for them to be able to actually move to Dynamics AX. And we would provide similar sort of tool set, and we're starting this with AX 2009. So why are we calling this a migrate as opposed to an upgrade, right? So I think traditionally when we do the upgrade, we would actually provide you with an ability to be able to move your data completely. That includes both the setup and configuration as well as your transactions that are open transactions as well as the historical transactions. Given the nature as what we have been able to do in the two major releases, that is AX 2012 as well as with Dynamics 365, product have gone through transformations in terms of the functionality. And we want customers who are running some of the legacy versions like 2009 to be able to have an opportunity to evaluate to see which of those features that what you've customized, because the product didn't support those capabilities before, to see if you could leverage the newer capabilities and to see if you could eliminate your customizations. From a business continuity perspective, we believe that you need to be able to actually bring in your setup and configurations as is, your master data, pretty much a good portion of your opening balances for your continuous reporting needs, as well as from the business continuity perspective, for you to be able to actually get your open transactions, for you to be able to actually get so that you could actually, as part of your cutover, stop your transaction processing on your earlier release, that is your AX 2009 in this case, and then continue your business onto the new release as well. So keeping that as a primary focus, what we are actually supporting is an ability for you to be able to migrate the complete setup information in terms of what was there in your earlier systems to Dynamics 365 for operations. That includes configuration setup, the master data like your customers, vendors, projects, etc. Will support migrating all the opening balances, including the transformations as how you would be able to actually bring that information in. The open documents, that is like, for example, your open purchase orders, sales orders, invoices, etc., so that you could continue completing those transactions in the new system, along with the system configurations like number sequences, users group, etc. We do believe that there are certain aspects of the product where you would typically want to actually look at historical transactions for either from an inquiry perspective or from a reporting perspective, etc. In a bit, I will actually talk about the underlying architecture and the migration processes, etc. And you will actually see anything that has an entity representation on the Dynamics 365 for operations side, you will be able to actually utilize the migration tool to actually move that information. What we don't want you to actually think about doing is to do the same as what you would traditionally used to do with the full upgrade approach, to move the historical transactions from the earlier releases to this one. And we really don't want you to do that, primarily because of all the complexities involved with the data model transformations, and no entity can be comprehensive in terms of all the different tables that you could probably be having to touch, depending on those closed or the posted transactions aspects of it between the originating module. For example, in the case of a purchase order, if you were to, the originating module might be between purchasing and the payables aspects of things, for it to be able to actually all the way propagate it to general ledger for the balances and the inventory. We don't want you to actually modify those entities and have data corruptions as part of that. We really want you to look at approaching historical transactions in a different way. So for example, we could have scenarios like, I need to be able to actually do historical transactions for my reporting requirements. I need to be able to actually look at my historical transactions. For example, I may be supporting returns, and for me to be able to actually complete the reporting requirement for completing my inquiry requirements around, I need to be able to look at historical price. for example, right? So we want you to be able to actually model these scenarios by bringing in only the relevant information from your historical transactions into Dynamics 365 for operations instead of bringing the whole thing. I'm going to pause for a minute to see if there are any questions. Gokul, are there any questions so far?
Nothing so far, Manoj.
Good. So the other thing that I would mention about looking at historical transactions is if it's purely inquiry or from a reporting, reasons that you need your historical transactions. With the new Power BI based capabilities, you can actually have reporting done or inquiries done based off of multiple data sources, and you could do mashups too if you would like to do this from an analysis perspective of information from multiple sources. And we will also offer templates for this out of the box, and that is something that what we are working on as well, so that you don't really have the need to move the historical transactions in a traditional way. So that's sort of what we intend to support with migrating the data. You would still have to actually look at the code aspects of things, and I'll talk about that in terms of what the approach needs to be, or rather what the methodology needs to be. So looking at what the architecture and the flow is going to look like, we will start by looking at what the methodology or the migration process itself is going to be. Let me complete the build of the slide. So what we recommend is that given how earlier this release was done and the evolution of the product since then, we would like for you guys to actually do a proper analysis of how you have actually extended the AX 2009 solution to meet your business process needs in comparison with what is available in Dynamics 365 for operations functionally. If any of those feature sets that have been introduced that could meet your business process requirements, we recommend that you actually go and obsolete the customizations and do the code migration only for the ones that which you intend to keep after the after obsoleting the customizations that you don't need anymore. And that is the fundamental thing to be successful with the migration to Dynamics 365 for operations. And the code upgrade exercise is no different than what you would typically go through with AX 2009 to AX 2012. There is no additional tool set that is available from a code perspective. You would have to bring that code into Dynamics 365 for operations using the new development experience for the data model, right from the data model changes all the way to the business logic and the other aspects of things. Once you have brought the ones that are relevant to you, the only additional thing that we would ask for you to do with regards to bringing the code is, for example, along with moving the data model changes, we want you to also make the relevant changes to the associated data entities on the Dynamics 365 for operations side. Once you've done that, you have a system ready that which you can actually use with the migration tool. We will provide a tool, and I'll show you the tool in its completeness in a bit. What we will actually see is we recommend that you also go through a set of pre-processing, and the pre-processing things are basically to do any kind of cleanup that you need to do before you start the migration efforts. And this cleanup could be, for example, purging any of those unwanted set of information that resides in your AX 2009 system, or if you need to archive, you could do that. Or if you were aware of, but you didn't have an opportunity, or you didn't felt the need to actually go in and do some cleanup for the aspects of the information that what you're maintaining within your AX 2009 system, you could go and do those data cleanups as pre-processing step before you start the migration exercise. Then using the tool, you would be able to define, or rather configure, which aspects of the setup, configurations, master data, and the opening balances and transactions in whatever fashion or the groups as how you would like to migrate. You would define those migration groups in that tool, and the system will actually use the data export import framework service to extract the information from 2009 system, and it will construct a data package. And the audience in this group should already be familiar with the Dynamics 365 for operations data management framework and the data package concepts. What we are doing is we're providing you with a mechanism by which the system will extract data package, which is a consumable artifact that which you can directly import into Dynamics 365 for operation. We also have capability or support enabled from the tool to directly point to a Dynamics 365 for operations instance and directly load the information from 2009 into Dynamics 365 for operations. Once you load it, the data management framework or the data export import framework aspects of things should be familiar to this group. The information gets loaded into the staging table, and once you are in the staging table, you can actually look at another level of transformations and data validations that you need to go do from your staging itself. And if there is a need be, you could do additional level of transformations, the data quality things like the dedupes and stuff that which you could do, and you could push the information from your staging to target, and then you could do another round of validations from the target. Once you have actually brought the information from 2009 into staging, till you perfect that data, you don't have to go back to 2009. You could repeat your set of things directly from the staging to validate, fix the data till you perfect it. And the way as how you expect this to be happening is the push to target here would basically be in a sandbox till you perfect it, and then once you have perfected it, you would push that clean data into your golden config environment. Once you have done that, you have a baseline of configurations that what you have actually moved, which you could use as the basis by which you create your development environment, test environments that would have the exact data as what you are used to in your 2009 system. We truly understand that the businesses will be continuing from the time once you start this migration, still using the AX 2009 system till you are ready to do the cutover. As a result of that, we support incremental updates too. So that means you start doing this migration process by defining the configurations of what aspects you want to migrate. And then once you get that information to the goal config, for any incremental changes that you've done in the 2009 system, the same migration groups can be used to extract information. So the tool keeps track of what were the parameters against which you had originally run, and it will bring in the new data from the original runs, basically the incremental changes. It will bring that again as a data package, and then from that point onwards, the load experience into Dynamics 365 for operations using data management framework is consistent. So you would be able to bring in continuous incremental changes in any frequency as you would want it into the target, which is your Dynamics 365 for operations. So it supports both initial migration as well as incremental iterations. So how does the tool really function, right? So here is a very simple view. So you have your 2009 database. We will provide the data migration tool that sits in the AX 2009 system. You have the sandbox, which is Dynamics 365 for operations. We'll do a level of pre-processing as I've described, that you will do the cleanup of the data, you will do purge, archive as appropriate, and you will keep the data only the ones that are relevant, that which you want to migrate. Then you use the system or the tool to actually define the templates, and then for your export, it uses the data export import framework. So customers who are familiar with, partners who are familiar with AX 2012 or the Dynamics 365 for operations, you would know that we have this data export import framework as a service. What we have done as part of providing this tool is we've backported that service to AX 2009. So that service sits in AX 2009, facilitates the exporting of the information based on the configurations that you've defined from the 2009 system. So based off of the migration groups that you've defined, the system will go and extract that information, read that from the 2009. For every table, it will export the files into a specific format, like it can be a spreadsheet or a comma separated file or an XML type file. And again, uses the tool reads the mapping definition, does the necessary mapping and the conversions that what it needs to go through from the source side, and it generates the data package. The generated data package can automatically be imported into the target Dynamics 365 for operations staging tables, or you can take them as a package, load them onto LCS, and then you can use that along with the config manager capabilities from lifecycle services to load them onto different environments of your Dynamics 365 for operations. I'll pause for a second. Gokul, are there any questions?
I have answered most of them. So there is one question saying in the PDF that we have uploaded, the page 5 is missing. Picture in the page 5 is missing, so we are working on re-uploading.
Apologies for that. So we'll actually make sure that the PDF includes the slide as well with the details of the process. I think it might have lost because of the build. So we'll eliminate the build and provide the slide. Sure. Any other questions, Gokul?
No, Manoj.
Okay. So what I wanted to do now is to transition from the PowerPoint to actually do a demo. So I'll do a screen shift. So what I'm showing you right now is, so I have an AX 2009 instance. What we have done as part of the tool is, the tool, as I've mentioned, provides two sets of aspects. So one is the data export import framework as a service itself, and also it has a set of forms that facilitates you to be able to define what aspects of the product that which you would like to migrate from AX 2009. It allows you to actually define those as configurations. We read those configurations and then export the information in any frequency as how you would like to export. We'll go through that in a bit. So the first piece that I mentioned was the export import framework as a service. So this would be a Windows service, which is what I'm showing you. So this runs on your AX 2009 system. So that is the first component, and we have created a new data migration area which has all the relevant forms that are related to this that which you would be using. So the first step that what you would be doing is you would define the companies that what you have in the system that you would like to migrate. You would do that by going to the migration company list. So when you go into this form, this system will actually list you all the companies that you have in your AX 2009 system. If it is a virtual company, it will automatically mark those as virtual companies. You would go in and enable whichever companies that you want to enable for migration. You don't have to enable all companies. You can start with enabling one company and then come back and repeat the process for the other companies too. So once you enable, you have an ability to be able to select the details. What the details process really does is it goes and analyzes all the tables in the system for that company, and it gets the first count in terms of the number of records that are there in the system. This will also give you a view in terms of which of those tables from the base system you have actually customized, and it will give you an indicator that you've actually customized these tables from the perspective of standard tables versus customizations that you need to make sure. You can actually extract this information in a spreadsheet, or you can actually look at only the row tables that has some rows, and you can ignore the ones that don't have any rows, and the ones that you have customization as your first checklist to make sure that if that data model change has already been done in your Dynamics 365 for operations, and you have entity representation of those in Dynamics 365 for operations. You do not have to have data entities in your 2009 system. 2009 will only have the source tables. You will only have the data entities on the Dynamics 365 for operations. What we are doing is to take the information from the 2009 tables, map that to the staging representation of those data entities in Dynamics 365, and do the export and transfer the information from 2009 to Dynamics 365. So this gives you the first level of information in terms of what tables you have data, which ones are those that you've customized, and you can actually look at the target site to make sure that you have transferred all the required data model changes that you've identified as part of the analysis phase that I described in the methodology that you intend to keep. This also becomes a good reference point for you to say, this is how much I'm actually having at the source, and you could reconcile that after you have moved that information onto the target to make sure that you've gotten exactly the same number of records on the target side. So this is fundamental in terms of migration, so you have an ability to be able to get that assessment. And you can come back and refresh this information as many times as you would want, and that is what you do over here. One other information as part of the virtual companies. So 2009 system, an ability for you to be able to share the data across companies, you would have used the capability of virtual company. In Dynamic 365 for operations, we do not have the concept of virtual company. So when you define this in 2009, you would have defined a company as virtual company, and you've defined relationships of which other standard legal entities are companies that participates in a relationship with that virtual company. You would use that same relationship on the target site and extract the information once and load them onto those respective companies on the target site. So the model in Dynamics 365 is data replication and not data sharing yet. So there is some aspects of data sharing feature that which we will enable. Today, that is purely a replication model based off of rules. From an extract to migrate perspective, you need to extract once and load them onto those respective companies on the target site. So that's the way as how we support the virtual companies from 2009 to Dynamics 365. Once you have identified and understood which companies you want to migrate and enable them and got the details and stuff, the next thing that you want to look at it is to make sure that you've configured the migration aspects from 2009 so that it understands where your Dynamics 365 for operations instances, what are the ways as how you would like the export to be done, etc. You do that in the configurations. So when you select the generate maps, think of these as the parameters for the migration tool itself. As I've mentioned, the tool generates a package which is a consumable artifact on the target side. So you need to specify where you would like the system to generate the package. So this path needs to be a path that which the system can actually write to, that includes wherever the AOS can write to. We need to make sure that the share has the right privileges. In this, I am actually running the whole AX 2009 as a one box, and that's why it is a local host. But otherwise, you would actually give the server name where you have installed the data export import framework service, which would be on the SQL server. We'll talk about the data conversion aspects in a minute. The first parameter that you see is what I call as default configuration. So if you recall what I had mentioned on the AX 2009 side, we have a table representation. On the Dynamics 365 for operations, we map that to the staging representation of the data entity definitions from the target side. What we have provided out of the box is a capability by which you could actually map those, and that is what you are actually providing. And this is a default spreadsheet that what we have provided. A sample view of what that spreadsheet is going to look like is something like this. You can see that on the source table, and then you can see the same information on the target side. I'll explain the source query aspects of it in a minute, but basically you are providing the reference to that spreadsheet right here, and we provide the spreadsheet as a starting spreadsheet for you. So this takes care of all the mapping for the standard entities. For your customizations and stuff, we have provided that capability by inferring the metadata directly from Dynamics 365 for operations, and I'll show that to you in a bit. So that source to target mapping in terms of tables to the data entity is what is provided out of the box using that spreadsheet. You provide some of the format information in terms of what it is. We read the information directly from the SQL Server on the 2009 site, and hence we require the credentials of the database so that we could use SSIS to extract the information. You have an ability to be able to validate to make sure that the information that you're provided is accessible by the service. You also specify where is your sandbox information of Dynamics 365 for operations. This helps us to identify all the metadata changes that what you've done. So this includes the data model changes, the data entities changes that what you've done on the Dynamics 365 for operations side, and we can extract that information from the sandbox. So you provide all the information about the target site as well here. And then the system parameters information is very basic, what language that you are trying to use, the chart of accounts delimiter, and you remember that I mentioned that we would support both the initial export as well as the incremental one. You have an ability to be able to version these, and the version numbers incremental scheme as how you would like to increment is what we actually get as a parameter. And you will see this as what I mean by that in a bit when I show you the export as well. So once you have done this, you can actually do this generate maps. So the initial source query template that what we have provided takes care of all the out-of-the-box tables and the corresponding staging table entities. You may have extended those source tables at what we have shipped in AX 2009 by adding net new columns, or you may have added net new tables as well as part of the customizations. In order to map your customizations, we provided this thing called generate maps. Once you have provided where your target environment is, that has the customizations already ported, and where your source is, you would be able to choose this generate maps. So this reads the metadata and updates the definition for all your customizations as well. So you don't need to go and edit the spreadsheets for every single time that you do this change. All you need to do is, as you make the changes to the data model, just come back here and select the generate maps. We will pick up the updated definition and keep the mapping references. So that's what you do as part of the configuring the migration tool itself. The next construct that I want to talk about it is an ability for you to be able to do the transformations on the source side itself. So there may be scenarios where we did not capture a particular part of information in AX 2009 that may be a required information in Dynamics 365 for operation. A classic example is the country information in a bank, for example. We didn't require them in 2009. We absolutely require them in Dynamics 365 for operation. So I want to provide a default value as I export for these kinds of scenarios. Another category of transformations could be the data that is represented in my source system is different from the data that as how I would be representing the same information on the target. To enable these kinds of things on the source itself, instead of you modifying them in your staging tables as part of the data management framework, we have provided a capability called data conversions. So when you select the data conversions, right, you define the data conversion rules at an extended data type level or an enumeration or the enum level. So any field that uses this extended data type or the enumeration, when you do the export, the system will apply the conversion rules if the conversion rules are enabled, which is what you saw in the parameter screen previously. So it will go and pick up the definition based on the conversion rules that is associated for that EDT. You can actually have more than one conversion rule for a particular EDT depending on different tables and the data as how you would want to maintain that. There is another places where you can actually control which conversion rule that you would want to apply, and I'll show that to you in a bit. But what is a conversion rule is it's fairly straightforward. For example, here the blank country region that I described. So address country region ID is the EDT that is used. When you look at the conversion value, you can say the source value is blank and I want to use the target value as whatever the target value is. This should resonate well with you guys. For any migration, this would be a standard experience as you would analyze the fields from the source to the target. And this helps you to actually define for any data conversions that you need to do. At the source side itself, you can go in and define these as rules. Another example is the different representation, right? So if you look at the unit convert, this is an enumeration that maps to unit round off EDT enum. When you look at this, so these are the source values and these are the target values as how I'm mapping to. This metadata is also inferred from the target side. You will be able to actually exactly use the same values of the enumeration instead of you providing some random values. This form does validate the data types, the information as well as the enumeration values to make sure that you don't have any corruptions introduced as part of you providing these values. So in order to enable to use this conversion, you do that at the whole system wide, and that is what this apply data conversion property is doing. Once you have done this, what you have done so far is you've enabled your companies that you want to migrate. You've gotten a good assessment of how many tables have data pertaining to that company, which of those tables that you've actually customized. You have an ability to reconcile to see if you have moved all those customizations onto the target. And once you have done that, you can also have an ability to be able to generate the mapping between the 2009 tables customizations to what was done on your Dynamics 365 for operations using the generate maps. You have defined your data conversion rules for your extended data types or the enumerations for the data differences so that you could do the change as part of the source itself along with the export. So that's what we have seen so far. The next 4 screens that what we are actually seeing are examples of constructs that have changed from AX 2009 functionally compared to Dynamics 365 for operations. All of these concepts are concepts that we have actually introduced in the AX 2012 release. Since you are moving from AX 2009 directly to Dynamics 365 for operations, we have provided a path for you to be able to migrate as well. So we'll go through those in a bit. So we'll start with financial dimension. So as you all know, financial dimension in AX 2009 used to be an array-based set of fields that which you could define, and you had an ability to be able to define only a finite of those. In AX 2012, we have changed that concept to be a backing table-based dimension. But also what we have provided you is we provided you with an ability to be able to define unlimited dimensions. And that concept got carried forward into Dynamics 365 for operations. So as part of you converting from 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations, we give you an ability to be able to say which of the dimensions in your 2009 system you want to migrate to target and how you would like to migrate. So that's what this configuration is about. So for example, this will list you all the dimensions of what you have in your source. You have an ability to be able to pick if we have already defined those dimensions, you have an ability to be able to map. So what the system would do is there is a backing entity that we have in Dynamics 365 for operations. What that entity would do is it'll pick up the definition based off of this mapping, and it will extract the data, load them onto the corresponding backing table that is already there if you are picking an existing dimension, and if you enable that existing dimension that you want to migrate. Instead, if you don't find that as a predefined dimension out of the box on the target side, you can also bring them as custom dimension. In this case, what we would do is we would do the backing table generation for you based on the enablement, and then we would create the data for you on the target side. The dimension-based balances that what you would have maintained will also be something that what we would actually compute and then maintain the opening balances for these dimensions on the target side if you enable the opening balance. So that's specifically in terms of how, since the concept has transformed differently from a functional standpoint, this configuration allows you to map to the new out-of-the-box dimensions, or you could bring them in as custom dimensions and we will migrate the data, create the dimension on the target side, migrate the data, and calculate the balances for you from an opening balance perspective. The same holds good on the inventory dimension aspects as well. So by company, you would be able to specify which of your inventory dimensions from your 2009 system that you want to enable for migrating to Dynamics 365 for operations side. The key reasons is why we're actually doing this is the inventory dimension structure is also changed from 2009 from a data model standpoint on the way as how we maintain that information. It's changed from 2009 to AX 2012, and hence it got carried forward to Dynamics 365 for operations, right? This is also relevant because when you extract the information for your open transactions, like for example, sales orders or purchase orders, you could have those inventory dimensions. We let you actually extract as individual dimensions on the source side, and we map them to the combination on the target side as part of our load. So that's why this configuration is relevant. So we do the transformation automatically for you, both from a configuration perspective as well as when you do the transaction export for open transactions, we will do the mapping for you. Chart of accounts is a construct that what we have actually changed between 2009 to 2012, and the concept again got carried forward with the new Dynamics 365 for operations. So what we have done with the chart of accounts is we now have an ability to be able to define a construct called account structure. So you could actually define not just the main account, but you can also have other dimensions as combinations at which you would like to capture as part of your transactions, and you can have one or more of these account structures. And these chart of accounts can be shared across legal entities from managing the accounting representations of capturing which account that you want to hit as you capture these transactions. Since from a 2009 perspective, we had this chart of accounts to be company specific, we give you an ability to be able to configure that by legal entity as how you would like to transfer. So something that used to be company specific, you have an ability to be able to change that to a shared chart of accounts if you want to leverage the new capabilities. So the first thing that you would do is you would define what the chart of accounts aspects are. So we give you an ability to be able to define. You just come in here for every legal entity that you enable. You have an ability to be able to specify, this is the chart of accounts that I want to. You actually do this as a definition. So you create a record here and you associate that to this legal entity, and hence tied to each of those main accounts, you have an ability to be able to specify us so that we could actually compute the opening balances for each of those from the source, and we would populate those opening balance on the target. And what we do is for every one of these chart of accounts that what you are actually creating, will also define an account structure by default for you. The last but not the least is actually the ledger. This is where you actually specify that you would like to actually use the same chart of accounts as what you had used in 2009, or you would like to use a new one that you would want to actually go in and use to share. The ledger is a construct that what we have introduced in 2012, and the ledger basically carries the accounting definitions as how you would like the legal entities transactions to be accounted. This is nothing but the combination of chart of accounts, calendar, and a currency that defines how the system and with a bunch of rules as part of the accounting framework that allows you to actually define how the legal entities transactions to be accounted. So if you had gone through AX 2009 to 2012 upgrade, we actually do one-to-one mapping of every legal entity would create a ledger by default. We give you the same mechanism here as a means by which you could configure. The only reason is why we have provided you with a form is so that you could specify, instead of using company specific chart of accounts as what you had maintained, you could come back here and then pick a different chart of accounts than what you had used. And as part of the load, we would transfer the balances appropriately to those main accounts as part of the migration. So tied to each legal entity, you have an ability to be able to pick the chart of accounts, and you can also specify what your currency is and your calendars, etc. So that's basically what you configure, and we would use this definition and use that backing data entity to load this information and create the ledger on the Dynamics 365 for operation. So these four set of forms that what you see are concept changes that what we have actually done between 2009 release to Dynamics 365 for operations. There's a couple of more things that what we have changed from a concept perspective. Retail is fundamentally different from 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations. The retail basis of concept changes will also lighten. Warehouse management is another concept that what has changed. We will bring in those aspects as well as part of the concept change that we would want to actually support, and those will light up shortly. The next two things that we do are the basis by which we will actually do the export. Entity list is the first thing that I wanted to show you. So this is really the meat of the work that what you would be actually doing as part of the migration effort. Once you have done the necessary setup, on the left hand side, you can actually see all the different modules in terms of what we actually support from a migration perspective. You can actually do this across the board, or you can also do this on a particular functional area if you were to. Here you can actually see, for example, you start with the ledger, and if you expand the ledger, you can actually see the different aspects that I was talking about in terms of what we support for a migration. So you see setup, configurations, transactions, the master data, the journals, and the miscellaneous sort of things that what you could possibly be transferring. If you see on the form, so one of the reasons as why we support these things is because in a typical implementation, we don't anticipate you to be migrating all or nothing type pattern. You could be doing this in different ways. You might have different functional teams responsible for different aspects of the business. Like you might have a team that is exclusively working on general ledger, and those business teams may be responsible for figuring out the source to target sort of what aspects they want to migrate, and they may be able to configure that. Another aspect is what we have thought about it is you don't necessarily have to do all the configurations and do the export once. You could actually do them in phases. So that means you could migrate your GL first for a relevant set of companies, do the validation, come back and do the next iterations to actually do customer sales and receivables. Then you could come back and do vendor purchasing, receiving and payables as a next set, etc. So if you wanted to do those types of phases, you could define respective migration groups, define them here, and then do the export of those, do the validations on the target side, and do your iterations that way too. So that's why you see these classifications on the left. On the right hand side, you would actually see what I was telling about. Like the source side, we actually have them as table, and the target side, we have them as data entities. You can actually see by category, we identify the source tables and the corresponding target entity in terms of what it is. So at this point in time, it is quite interesting because if you recall, I said we enabled some of these things out of the box, that which you can also customize or configure, right? So that's what the next set of controls that you see. Based on the type of information, we have by default considered certain set of tables that are candidates for migration. You will see them enabled out of the box. But you have an ability to be able to go in and say, even though you have considered these as enabled for migration, we as a company using AX 2009 don't use this information or don't want this to be migrated to Dynamics 365 for operation. You have an ability to be able to say, select for migration or change the ones that what we have done, and you have an ability to be able to override that what select for migration is. So consider for migration is out of the box as what we are recommending. You have an ability to be able to override, and you can do this thing. We have provided a couple of other support for this thing. So one of the things is, for example, if you're doing customers, right? If you take customer as an example, you want to actually select customer and all customer related information. So wherever the information is actually shared or related from a customer standpoint, you want to actually extract all of those sort of things. So if you wanted to do that, and if you want to enable only those or select those for migration, we have an ability for you to be able to say activate all or activate only the ones that are related. When you do the activate related, we actually go in and infer the table relations from the source and select all of the ones that has the relationships defined, and we enable that for migration, and you would be able to actually define a migration group and extract the data for those. So we've provided different means by which you could actually go in and do, depending on what is the relevant or the more meaningful approach for you guys. You can adapt that approach to actually define the migration groups here. Once you have done that, we have this concept called migration groups. You could define migration groups directly from the entity list, but you can also define migration groups for ad hoc capabilities right from here. So let's go ahead and define one. And you can select the company for which you would want to actually be able to go in and do. So let me just pick up a company. And I'll go to the entities. So this is where you have an ability to be able to actually go in and specify which of those entities. Sorry, that's not what I was looking for. Sorry. So since we didn't do anything from a select for migration perspective, we're doing an ad hoc migration group here. So you can actually specify whichever tables that you want to migrate. So let's pick the ones that is something that we can actually comprehend in this one, right? So just from a demo perspective, I want to look at customer groups, right? So you can see the source table as cus group, and then the target entity is cus customer group entity from the Dynamics 365 for operations. We actually do, so you can select this for migration now. We automatically do the mapping for you between the source table fields and the target ones, that whatever that we could infer. I'm showing this to you because I have customization in this as well. So if you see the field mapping, it actually has the standard fields, but also it has some custom fields as well, right? So you can see that the system was able to actually map some fields, but it's not able to map everything. So you can actually come back here and you can actually map the ones based off of the target staging field ones. So you have an ability to be able to override. So we strive our best to make sure that the entities field names have been consistently maintained based off of the field names that have been used in the previous releases, so that we could do these kinds of tooling. But if you have modified the field names, you have an ability to be able to come here and change those mappings if you would want to. If you recall, I talked about data conversions, and you have an ability to be able to specify what conversion rule that you want to use. That is what you are doing here. So it'll automatically pick up a conversion rule if that is defined for the EDT associated with this field. But you have an ability to be able to override a specific one if you have more than one, and you do that right from here. Once you have done that, we also provide an ability for you to be able to write queries. And the reason for why we do this is because if you don't do this, the default query that we do is select star from this table. But oftentimes what you want is, so for example, I talked about open transactions. We have provided a default query for you that says select star from sales orders where a particular status is representing the open transaction status. So you can also go in and write custom queries here. This query actually takes ANSI syntax queries. So this is another means by which you could do additional filters and transformations. So, and that's why I said particularly any ANSI SQL. So you could do case expressions and things like that, which is more than the transformation that what you could define as part of the conversion. You could define them here. So this is not an X++ SQL format. This is actually the format by which we actually, you could write it as a direct SQL. You provide them here and we give you an ability to be able to validate that as well. So once you have defined this migration group, you have an ability to be able to go do an export. And this, you remember as part of the parameters in the generate maps, I talked about versioning your exports. So that is what this is. Since this is the first time I'm actually running this, the Delta run is not enabled. It defaults all those parameters in terms of what formats that you would want to do is all brought up here. You would typically not be exporting just customer group. You would be importing a lot of information or a combinations of tables as however you would want to do your migrations. So you do them. So we support both in-client as well as batch executions if you were to, and it extracts them as a data package and it defaults the path that what you provided. And it helps you to actually import the package to the target if you want to directly import them to the staging instance that what you've specified in the configurations here. It can directly import that data package to there as well. So once you do this, so here you can basically see it'll export and it'll create a data package in the path that what you've actually specified. So here's the package that what we have created. So TechTalk was the migration group that we had created. CEU was the company, and this is the package. So this package, you can directly import it into Dynamics 365 for operations. Since I didn't do that directly load, it populates this package into the folder, and you can take this and load it into LCS. So that part of the flow, you would have seen it in the data management TechTalk. That flow is exactly the same, right? Couple of more things that I want to. So for whatever reason that you need to actually run this again, you have an ability to be able to look at the execution history, or if you want to export again, you have an ability to be able to pick that particular version and it will actually go in and infer all the parameters and it will extract the same configurations for you. But now if you do an export now, you will actually see that Delta Run enabled and it will actually open up the same job name with an incremental version, and you can actually change the parameters if you would want to, and you can run this as many times as you would want and it will pick up the incremental runs. So that's in a nutshell in terms of what the tool does for you. Gokul, are there any specific questions? I'm sure there would be.
Yeah, Manoj, in terms of pending questions, we have one question around is there any requirement around the new DIXF service in terms of SQL version 2012 or higher?
That is an excellent question. So we do require that as part of the backport that we expect the system to be running on SQL 2012 or 2014 or SQL 2016. We understand that customers who are running 2009 are still running in SQL 2008 or 2008 R2. We're looking at backporting the DIXF service to 2008 as well. But if you want to take advantage of this tool today, we expect you to have your 2009 box running in SQL 2012. At least from an out-of-the-box perspective, we have tested AX 2009 base release as well as the service pack 1s, including the localizations, by directly importing that into SQL 2012, 2014, and 2016. We did not see any issues with that. And we have also tested this with about 8 customers where we had them run a sandbox in SQL 2012 or 2014, and we did not see any issues with that so far.
Okay, thanks, man. One question I consistently got is the tool currently available and how partners or customers can get it?
So this tool is available in what we call as a public preview mode now. So if you do need it, we can actually provide this tool to you. Do reach out to us and we can actually provide this tool's access to you. As part of your Dynamics 365 for operations effort, you will actually have an SA who would be working with you, work with that solution architect, and they would be able to get access to this tool to you.
Okay. Next question I have is target table or fields are coming directly from D365 for operations sandbox database. I can answer this. So yes, the fields are coming from the target tables, but keep in mind that what we are exposing is the entity. So if there are fields on the entity, that is what we are mapping to. And the next question I have is so we need the application running on SQL AX 2012 mandatory, not a copy of SQL 2008 DB upgraded to 2012. So Manoj, question is, if they have a DB upgraded from 2008 to SQL 2012, is that fine?
That is perfectly fine.
Okay, and one more question, must the field mapping set up per company?
So the field mapping aspects of things, you actually define them for a migration group, and that can be used for one or more companies. You don't necessarily have to do this, but if you do want to do this on a per company basis, you would define a different migration group and associate that to the company, as I've shown you. You have capabilities for both.
One last question, can we use this tool to migrate to AX 2012?
The short answer is no, specifically because we're actually mapping this based on the construct in terms of Dynamic 365 for operations. If the entity definitions are the same, the extracted files, directly the Excel files or the CSV files can be used to import into 2012, but there's no concept of data packages and stuff, and that is not something that is a construct that you would be able to use. But the exported information can be imported into 2012 if the entity definitions are the same, because they're using the same concepts. So just in the interest of time, right? So I just wanted to really thank you all for joining today. Janice, I'll hand it over back to you.
All right, thank you, Manoj. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to bring your attention to the URL that I posted in the messages panel. It's on the left-hand side of your screen. That's the link to a short survey for this web conference. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference or have feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. And with that, that's going to conclude today's Infopedia web conference. Attendees can access the web conference recording via a link that will be delivered within 3 to 5 business days post-conference. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters, Manoj and Gokul, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today. This does conclude today's web conference, and you